All right. I mean, I think everybody here is familiar with the Wannsee Conference as a phenomenon, and one of the reasons for that, I think, is because of this film, Conspiracy, from 20 years ago. In my opinion, one of the few good and compelling portrayals of Nazis on screen. It's very hard now, for me at least, to think about Himmler without picturing Kenneth Branagh, which is quite a strange phenomenon, and perhaps even stranger to imagine Eichmann as Stanley Tucci, which is kind of weird. But now they're kind of forever fixed in my head in these roles. But it's a really remarkable film, I think, and gives, although we can never know for sure, gives a pretty compelling idea of what actually took place at Wannsee. And I think it's one that closely follows the historical literature as it took place at that time. But the question, I think, still remains, what precisely was the role of the Wannsee Conference in the development of the final solution? And so it's that I want to try and address insofar as I can in this talk this evening. So let me start by saying something about the context of autumn 1941, before the conference. Or I suppose, I mean, we call it the Wannsee Conference, but really we should say the meeting. I mean, I think it was billed as a Besprechung, so a conversation or a meeting rather than a conference. But I think one of the ways in which we've turned it into something perhaps grander than it was is by the way we name it. But we can come back to that. Himmler's initial aim had been, I think, this is what he said at Wannsee, was to comb Europe from west to east. And this is what Heydrich explained at Wannsee. But in fact, the mass murder of the Jews began in the east and then spread to the west. By the time the process of deporting Jews had started in Western Europe, the final solution, as opposed to local or regional solutions imposed on the Jews of the Soviet Union or Poland, was largely in place. And like the Jews of the ghettos in Poland, headed by their beleaguered Jewish councils, the Jewish councils in Vienna and elsewhere in Central and Western Europe were put in positions of authority by the Nazis, but were without power of their own. By the spring of 1942, the final solution was in place, as recognizable as a continent-wide program. Before that point, the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, had killed well over 1 million Jews in the Soviet Union. Jews from the Reich were deported to Riga in November 1941. The first mass killings by gas had begun at Chelmno, and construction had started on the death camp at Belzec in December 1941. On the 23rd of October 1941, the Nazis forbade all emigration of Jews from occupied Europe, and around the same time, the first experimental gassings of Soviet prisoners of war took place at Auschwitz. Whatever the precise order of the decision-making process, it's clear that by the end of 1941, the Nazis were working towards a comprehensive plan of mass murder. Historians have added lots of detail over the last 20 years or so. For example, with respect to the creation of the Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, the link between the euthanasia program and the killing of the Jews, or the role played by local planners in occupied Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, what seems clear is that the Nazis were turning localized programs of mass killing into a continent-wide genocide by the end of 1941. The direction of travel was clear. Following the initial success of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler gave the go-ahead for the first deportations from the Reich and from the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and Goering transferred his control over Jewish policies to Heydrich in his famous authorization letter of the 31st of July 1941, where Goering wrote, "I hereby charge you with making all necessary preparations in regard to organizational and financial matters for bringing about a total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe." This is a letter which was perhaps written by Goering in order to save face as a kind of de facto recognition of the SS's unstoppable rise to prominence. And nowhere, I think, is this process of the SS's rise clearer to see than in the infamous Wannsee Conference. So the meeting took place in this beautiful villa along the shores of the Wannsee, just outside Berlin, 80 years ago today, on the 20th of January, 1942, having been postponed from its initial date of the 9th of December, 1941, because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the entry of the Americans into the war. Just as an aside, I would say that the entry of the Americans into the war was not the moment of the decision for the final solution, for the reasons given above. This is an argument that has been made by Christian Gerlach and other historians, but I think the fact that the death camp at Belzec was already being built, the fact that the gas vans at Chelmno were already operating, that mass murder had taken place in Serbia, in the Baltic states and elsewhere, suggests that this was a process that was already underway. The American entry into the war was an important step, but I don't think we can argue decisively that this was when the decision for the final solution was taken. The meeting was chaired by Heydrich, with his deputy, Adolf Eichmann, taking the minutes. Sitting around the conference table were 15 senior officials, you can see who they were here, representing most of Nazi Germany's important ministries and RSHA agencies. Saul Friedlander argued that at Wannsee, Heydrich presented the outline of the final solution to the invited representatives of various ministries and SS agencies, and that, quote, the establishment of extermination camps in the general government in the following months eliminates any possible remaining doubt or vagueness about what was meant at Wannsee. His claim has been backed up many times by historians who agree, as Peter Fritsche puts it, that the main purpose of the Wannsee Conference was to provide notice that the SS, under the leadership of Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler, intended to organize deportations on a Europe-wide scale. I think that's correct, but deportations, I'll come back to this in a minute, deportations on a Europe-wide scale does not necessarily mean mass murder at Wannsee, not in exactly the way that took place a couple of months later. So it's I think it's important, as various historians have argued, to read the minutes insofar as we have them literally, but that also means paying attention to what the Nazis meant by deportations at this precise moment in time. So the precise role played by the Wannsee Conference remains disputed. Clearly, it cannot have been the site where the final solution was decided upon, as historians sometimes used to claim. That makes no sense in terms of what we would today call an intentionalist narrative that used to prevail. In other words, one that maintains that the Nazis had always intended to kill the Jews. I mean, if they'd always intended to kill the Jews, there would have been no need for a meeting in order to decide to kill the Jews in 1942. So that doesn't really make very much sense. It also doesn't make sense because neither Himmler nor Hitler were present. And so if this was the moment when the final solution was decided upon, it seems highly unlikely without Hitler or Himmler being there. Furthermore, as some of the SS representatives who'd arrived fresh from the Baltic states were happy to confirm, they had already begun making their regions free of Jews, Estonia and Latvia especially. It seems much more likely that the meeting was partly about coordination, but primarily about stamping the SS's control over Jewish policy and creating a situation whereby other agencies, especially those belonging to the state, that's to say the civil service, rather than the Nazi party, would be rendered complicit in the project. In the words of Mark Roseman, the author of the standard work on the Wannsee Conference, the meeting, quote, was part of a concerted, coordinated campaign by Himmler and Heydrich to assert their supremacy. The latter's major aim was to achieve unity and common purpose among the participants, and above all, to secure acceptance of the RSHA's leading role. This explanation seems much more persuasive when one considers that the discussion, according to Eichmann, was short on detail and focused more on general principles and grandiose aspirations, with the only detailed discussion being reserved for the problem, as the Nazis saw it, of how to deal with different grades of Mischlinge or mixed race Jews. And you can see here, it's probably not very readable, but this, the longest section of the Wannsee Protocol deals with these details of different definitions of different grades of Mischlinge. And this is the only point at which the discussion becomes technical and in a sense disputed and goes into any kind of detail. All in some ways rather pointless anyway, but nevertheless this is where the meeting got kind of technical. I'll come back to that. Well, and this is particularly, I think, important for ensuring the complicity of the ministries. That's to say, those civil servants outside of the Nazi party, because the representatives from the Ministry of the Interior, the Justice Ministry, and so on, by entering into these discussions, this was the way in which they became complicit in the general principle of what was being discussed at Wannsee. So the reason why Wannsee was long thought of as the moment when the final solution was launched is largely serendipitous. The discovery of the one surviving copy of the record or protocol of the meeting, which the recipients had been instructed to destroy, by Robert Kempner, a former German Jewish lawyer and civil servant, in 1947, when he was working as US Assistant Chief Counsel in the Nuremberg trials, particularly in the ministry's case, one of the subsequent trials of the Nuremberg military tribunal. The document, as Roseman says, is probably the closest the Nazis ever came to writing down their overall plan of genocide. In that sense, the meeting did indeed mark a kind of turning point from more or less ad hoc mass killings to the systematization of a process which ended in continent-wide genocide. If it was not where the decision was taken, but more an echo of a previously made decision or an incipient decision, Wannsee did capture the midway point in the transition from quasi-genocidal deportations to a clear program of murder. Besides, for all the debate and the euphemisms, the genocidal implications were totally and unmistakably clear. As Eichmann testified at Jerusalem, and you can see part of his testimony here, these gentlemen were standing together or sitting together and were discussing the subject quite bluntly, quite differently from the language which I had to use later in the record. During the conversation, they minced no words about it at all. They spoke about methods for killing, about liquidation, about extermination. And this is where we have a slight problem, because the minutes talk about labor, forced labor, and deportation to the east after the war. So a mass plan for deportation, but not yet for mass murder in gas chambers. This is what changed in the following weeks and months after the Wannsee Conference. In other words, on the 20th of January 1942, insofar as the minutes of the meeting tell us, there was no call for systematic and immediate mass murder of all Europe's Jews. But the discussion nevertheless catalyzed this process as it developed and unfolded over the following months. And I think what Eichmann says in Jerusalem, which is that irrespective of what's in the minutes, these gentlemen stood around talking about killing, about liquidation, about extermination, means that we can, I think, agree with Roseman that this is perhaps the closest that the Nazis ever came to setting down their program of genocide. And this is, I think, probably the most famous section of the protocol. This is most obviously clear in this famous table. I'm just reproducing. This is from the USHMM documents. Here is a clearer version of it. This document, which lists the Eichmann's estimates of the numbers of Jews in each of the countries of Europe, is remarkably accurate in the first instance. But of course, the thing that's really noteworthy about it is that it includes in section A, Germany and countries that are already occupied by the Third Reich. And in section B, it includes, first of all, countries allied to Nazi Germany. And you can see, obviously, Romania is there with a very large number of Jews. It also includes countries not yet occupied by Nazi Germany or only partly occupied by Nazi Germany, such as the USSR, and it includes the neutral countries. The implication of which is that all the Jews of Europe will sooner or later be swallowed up into this Nazi program of deportation. The other thing that I think is very striking about this is the thoroughness, the jusqu'au bout nature of this document. The Nazis are interested in the 5 million Jews in the USSR. They're also interested in the 200 Jews in Albania. From the Nazis' perspective, a Jew is a Jew. They all have to be got rid of. And that, I think, is it screams loud and clear from this document. Wannsee, however, is not just important as one of the key moments in the unfolding of the Nazis' genocidal mindset. When you picture the 15 leading Nazis sitting around the table in the sumptuous villa that Heydrich planned to claim for himself after the war, it becomes clear that the optics and the aesthetics of the meeting were equally significant. The meeting looks, in retrospect, like an exemplary scene in the Nazis' staging of their own myth as the master race. These smug, self-satisfied men, sure of their own superiority, discussed, whilst being fed fine food and wine, the intricacies of mass murder and the legal problems that arose from them. They laughed and joked, they argued and fell into line, and the massive disjunction between their self-performance and the reality of what it all meant is devastating. So that's, I think, is the meeting. Let me say something then about, to try and say how, to illustrate why the conference was not the decision, but to set it into a broader context. You can see the place of Wannsee in the unfolding of the decision-making process. So whatever the precise timing, in the months after the meeting, the deportation trains started to roll across Europe. Until then, as I have already noted, Jews had been shot in Eastern Europe in huge numbers. They'd been shot in Serbia, gassed in vans in Chelmno. The Operation Reinhard camps were being readied to receive and kill the Jews of the general government. Some Jews had been deported from Germany to Minsk, Riga, Izbica, and elsewhere, but not in very large numbers and not in a very systematic fashion. Now, the Jews of the Protectorate, Slovakia, and Western Europe were targeted for deportation and murder, and they would be joined soon after by the Jews of Greece, Norway, Croatia, and other countries. I don't have to tell people here that the Romanian case is rather different. After the brutality of the Iași and Bucharest pogroms in 1941, systematic deportations did take place, not to death camps in the Nazi fashion, because the Germans refused to take them in autumn 1941, but to death by massive neglect, abandonment to the elements, and large-scale massacres in Transnistria, particularly in Akhmechetka and Dumanevka and Bogdanovka. Although Auschwitz was not, as popular memory has it, the place where the majority of the Holocaust's victims were killed, had it not been for the deportation and murder of the Jews of Hungary in the spring of 1944, more Jews would have been killed at Treblinka than at Auschwitz. Nevertheless, Auschwitz did become the killing center for Jews from across Europe and the center of a vast slave labor operation. By the end of 1941, then, the leading Nazis were beginning to speak openly of what was now becoming a continent-wide program. On the 15th of November 1941, Himmler met Rosenberg. 3 days later, the latter told the German press that, quote, "In the East, some 6 million Jews still live, and this question can only be solved in a biological eradication of the entire Jewry of Europe." According to Goebbels, at a meeting on the 12th of December 1941 in his private apartment in Berlin, Hitler told the assembled Reichsleiter and Gauleiter, that's to say some of the regime's leading officials, that, quote, "The world war is here. The destruction of the Jews must be the inevitable consequence." That's a reference back to Hitler's famous prophecy of 30th of January 1939, that should there be a world war, the result would not be the Bolshevization of the earth, but the liquidation of Europe's Jews. And Hans Frank, the Governor General, told his underlings on the 16th of December, quote, "We must put an end to the Jews. That I want to say quite openly. Gentlemen, I must ask you, arm yourselves against any thoughts of compassion. We must destroy the Jews wherever we encounter them and wherever it is possible in order to preserve the entire structure of the Reich. In this process, we see for the first time also the vital role played by the cooperation of the Nazis' allies. In Eastern Europe, huge numbers of Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Latvians took part in the killing of Jews carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and its associated forces, particularly the Order Police, as the Nazis rapidly created auxiliary police forces from the local populations. These so-called Hiwis, Hilfswillige or volunteers, played an essential role, not only in identifying Jews, but in murdering them too. Many men from these countries went on to become camp guards, especially the infamous Travniki men, named after the training camp where they were brought into the perpetrator fold. Over the year 1942, the number of locals in the occupied Soviet territories, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, recruited to work under the Order Police rose nearly tenfold, from 33,000 to about 300,000. A little later, faced with the choice of signing up or dying an agonizing death through starvation in Nazi captivity, some 800,000 Russians joined the so-called Vlasov army and fought on the side of the Wehrmacht, mostly as cannon fodder. The auxiliaries, in the words of one historian, provided proof that with minimal German input, the Third Reich could realize its destiny. The Travniki men not only served as foot soldiers of the final solution, they also represented prototypes for the enforcers of the world that the Nazis intended to construct. Western Europe, however, I think should not be neglected. It also wasn't unimportant in this process. It's not simply the case that the killings began in the East and then spread to the West. Rather, the deportations of Jews from Western Europe were undertaken in the full knowledge of the killings in the East, while the latter was still ongoing. In other words, the decision-making process for the final solution was shaped by the occupation of Western Europe too. The post-war statement given by Eichmann's deputy, Dieter Wislicheny, for example, indicates that Western Europe was always conceived of as part of the final solution. Werner Best, formerly Heydrich's representative and legal advisor to the SS, and then head of the SD in France between 1940 and 1942, before becoming German commissioner in Denmark, remarked in March 1941, that Germany's interest lies in progressively relieving all European countries from Jewry, with a goal of a completely Jew-free Europe. The rapid intensification of the killings in Eastern Europe gave the green light to those in the occupied West who also favored radical action. Otto Abetz, for example, the German ambassador in Paris, argued to Himmler in September 1941 that lack of space for arrested Jews, in fact, a lack of space which, of course, the Nazis had contrived, meant that the Jews should be transported from France to the East, a request to which Himmler eagerly agreed. There were, in other words, processes at work in the countries of occupied Western Europe, which fed the radicalizing dynamic of the unfolding final solution, processes which paralleled and fed off those occurring in the so-called Wild East. In Western Europe, the extent of collaboration varied from country to country and depended on the nature of the occupation regime imposed locally by the Germans. In the Netherlands, where the penetration of the SS was deep, in a country with a topography which hardly facilitated hiding, and where the Jewish population was heavily concentrated in one city, Amsterdam, in a few districts there, the death rate was 75%, far higher than in France, where the proportion of Jews killed was 25%. Yet in Marshal Pétain's Vichy, France had a regime which was not only collaborationist, but eager to show its devotion to the Nazis' anti-Semitic agenda by taking the initiative on anti-Jewish legislation. In October 1940, Vichy introduced the first Statut des Juifs, defining in strict terms who was a Jew, and in spring 1941, it created the Commissariat Général aux Questions Juives in order to deal with the Jewish problem in France. As Deborah Dwork and Robert Jan van Pelt write, the Jews in France, both native-born and refugee, believed that French authorities would seek to safeguard them. France was the country of the rights of man, of asylum, of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Those were the founding principles of the state. Jews who had fled to France from the Nazi regime elsewhere in Europe trusted in the national promise of protection. They were utterly betrayed. Nevertheless, the Pétain regime balked at deporting French citizens, with the result that, when pressed to do so by the Germans in September 1942, as it had previously agreed to do, it held firm. Only a small percentage of the 75,000 Jews deported from France were French citizens, which hardly speaks well for the country of asylum, but which does show that genocide is complex and that thinking of actors in terms of fixed roles cannot capture the fluid nature of such a complicated and shifting reality. Vichy contributed to the failure of the final solution in France, as well as its initiation. The actions of the Vichy regime demonstrate that where legally recognized states continued to function in Nazi Europe, they could both accede to and resist Nazi demands. They could also initiate the murder process themselves without being pressured into doing so by the Germans. The case of Romania is perhaps the best example. For the victims of these murderous policies, which by the spring of 1942 had ensnared most of the European continent's Jewish communities, the result was disastrous. By that point, the Nazis' final solution was in place, and Jews across Europe were marked for death. For the different Jewish populations actually to be captured, deported, and murdered, however, required a high degree of collaboration across the continent, something that was not discussed at Wannsee. So Wannsee, I think I wanted to give that broader discussion just to give a bigger picture, to show that what's going on elsewhere in Europe, in France and Romania and so on, isn't really captured by the minutes that we have from Wannsee. So Wannsee, I think, was not the place where the decision for the final solution was taken, but it was one important step in the process of turning a fantasy designed for the post-war period into horrifying reality in 1942. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there.